Hi, my name is Olivia Lee and I'm an associate in the London office at Hunton Kurth. I'm going to discuss some of the employee management issues that may arise as employees return to work as COVID-19 continues to circulate in the general population. When the pandemic first hit, the priority for most employers was figuring out how they were going to manage their employees from a distance and online. In the coming months, the focus is going to move more towards ensuring that people can return to workplaces safely. So the measures that may be employed will include testing, screening, and possibly contact tracing, some of which may be intrusive and not all of which will necessarily be effective. So these are some of the factors that should be considered when deciding on which measures are appropriate for your workplace. In particular, employers need to balance their duty to protect their workforce against their obligation to process data responsibly and in accordance with the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. The first consideration will likely be the jurisdiction that an office is based in. European data protection authorities, or DPAs, have taken somewhat differing approaches to the processing of employee health data during the pandemic. Some, such as the UK's ICO, or Information Commissioner's Office, have stated that employers may collect health data where required, provided this is limited to what's necessary and that it is adequately protected. But other DPAs have explicitly prohibited employers from collecting information relating to, for example, potential symptoms, such as through temperature checks or through medical questionnaires. It will also be important to refer to the most recent advice issued by DPAs, because many have updated their advice as the pandemic has evolved. And employers also need to consider, in light of the guidance that's relevant to their offices, whether to tailor the approach by jurisdiction or take a global approach. And if the latter approach is preferred, then they should identify those safeguards that would be required to ensure compliance with the most stringent DPA guidance that applies to them. The nature of the business in question is also another consideration, and what would be proportionate based on that. This concept of proportionality underpins a lot of the EU's data protection regime, and even those DPAs that have placed fewer restrictions on the collection of employee data have emphasised that collection should not go beyond what's absolutely necessary. So the proportionality of certain measures will vary depending on the nature of the business, the number of employees it has, how easily they can work from home, their likely proximity to each other in the office, and their level of interaction with the public. Employers would need to assess the vulnerability of the workforce generally and consider how social distancing might be implemented in their workplace. They'll also need to consider the vulnerability of individual employees. Those most at risk may need to continue working from home, and if they can't, then more extensive or more frequent data collection may be proportionate in their case, especially for those who have regular contact with the public. The preferences of employees themselves should also be considered. Some workforces, particularly those operating in close proximity to their colleagues or to members of the public, might request that monitoring of COVID-19 symptoms be carried out for their own protection. If employers do decide to carry out more intrusive measures like testing at work, they should also consider whether additional safeguards might lower the risk of enforcement by a DPA, for example, by not recording the results of temperature checks after carrying them out. Employers also need to consider how they're going to store the data, especially if the organisation doesn't routinely collect special category data like health data and therefore may not have the appropriate security measures in place already. And where health data is being collected as special category data, employers will need to consider the general prohibition on the processing of special category data that exists under Article 9 of the GDPR and consider whether they have an appropriate derogation to rely on to that prohibition.